going to keep bumping. Can you scoot over a tiny bit more?
Today about, my name is Nicole, Cottle, and I'm going to moderate today. We're going to talk today about public infrastructure districts, and we have a couple of real experts with us. So public infrastructure districts are a relatively new tool in name, I would say, legislatively. They've gained a lot of traction in Utah and have been heavily used in the last couple of years, but it's not an unusual model per se, just a new tool added to our tool chest by the legislature a couple of years ago. So we'll get in depth with our panel here. Let me start by introducing Brennen Brown. Brennen is the managing director of D.A. Davidson Special District Group, leading the firm's public finance banking efforts in Utah. He and his team manage more than $120 billion of AUM and tax-free investments. I'm sure I'm saying that right. And has led investment of more than $2 billion in special district debt across the country. Brennan's is it fair to say native of Utah?
I am.
Went to BYU.
Yep.
Graduated from BYU, native to Utah. So happy to have him. And D.A. Davidson is kind of well known across the state now as one of the leading providers of this kind of I don't know that we call it service, but service as you go through this. And then we also have with us Mike Sullivan. And Mike is the Senior Vice President in the Piper Sandler Special District Group. Sullivan brings more than 8 years of debt, capital, and markets and special district finance experience to his team. He's responsible for Colorado and Utah. And before joining Piper Sandler, was Vice President at D.A. Davidson. So we have kind of intermingling here going on. Happy to have both of them with us. We're going to start by just running through a presentation that helps to get us a good understanding of the basics of this, and then we'll open it up to questions and ask a few questions of our experts here, but please feel free to engage. We're in a smaller room now, so it's easier to do that. So if you have questions as we're going through, I'm sure both Mike and Brennen will be willing to hear them.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll turn it over to you.
That sounds good. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to do this, and thank you for the kind introductions, Nicole. Mike and I put a joint presentation together that we can just walk through to just talk about the basics of what a public infrastructure district is, but I think the majority of the time we can spend on Q&A or talking about examples of when this tool has been used and how it can be helpful to cities, to developers, anyone involved with sort of the infrastructure process and constructing it and planning and designing it. And so happy to spend plenty of time answering questions from all of you, and hopefully we can be helpful in some way. So with that, actually one other thing that might be helpful, who's here from a governmental entity? How many from developer or private entity? Okay. So a little more heavily weighted towards governmental, but good mix of both. That's helpful. So yeah, let us maybe just walk through this slide deck really briefly, and then we'll get into questions and answers. So I don't know, Mike, do you want to take us away?
Sounds great. You want to do the next slide. The very brief overview of public infrastructure districts. As Nicole mentioned, they are very new. Very new meaning that Senate Bill 228, which allowed for the creation of public infrastructure districts, was passed in 2019. PIDs, we'll call them PIDs for just purposes of this discussion now that we've defined that term, have defined boundaries. They are used to issue debt, to fund public infrastructure, tax increment revenues and fees, and additional property tax or assessment can be generated from within those PIDs boundaries to pay for bonds that were issued upfront to pay for infrastructure to accelerate growth. PIDs are approved by cities and counties or their governing entity that they sit within. So this brings the developer and the governing entity into the same room together to approve public infrastructure districts, and we'll go through kind of that process in another slide. And they're used fairly ubiquitously across all types of development: commercial, industrial, mixed use, residential, We'll get into why that's the case here coming up, but it can be used fairly uniformly from a standpoint of a financing vehicle. I think in the past, Utah's had kind of other local districts that have been used to finance infrastructure, but have mainly been components of cities or counties, meaning that the debt of that district sits on the balance sheet of the city or the county in which that district resides. PIDs do not. PIDs are a separate local governmental entity. They have their own board of directors, they have their own insurance, they have their own liability, their own audit, their own budget, their own lawyers, accountants. They are completely separate from the city or the county after the city or the county approves them and creates them.
Yeah, one thing that might be helpful as well to mention on the slide, PID is a financing vehicle. Its only purpose is to finance infrastructure. And so obviously we're in a very interesting market. There's a lot of inflation, cost escalation, and so, who knows what will come, but infrastructure is expensive. It's always been expensive. It's very expensive right now. And so that capital needs to go into the ground before anything else can happen, right? And so to get to a revenue event, to get what a city wants or a developer or others want, whether that's tax revenue generation or a working project, you have to be able to have a pathway to that revenue event. And so the PID is a tool to finance the infrastructure and then to repay it over a long period of time. And the idea is that the users of that infrastructure, meaning the people within that defined boundary, are the ones that are going to repay it and ultimately be responsible to pay for the infrastructure that serves them on a daily basis. So typically, or historically, that burden has sort of, if you look over 20, 30, 40 years or even longer, that burden has sort of been a pendulum that has swung between cities and counties to private enterprise and developers, and maybe there's a reimbursement tool. And so depending on what time period you're looking at, that burden has fallen on either local jurisdictions directly or on private entities with maybe some reimbursement through impact fees or some other thing like that. And so a PID is, again, just a separate way to finance the infrastructure outside of those historical ways it's been done, and then to have it repaid by really the people that are going to be using that infrastructure every day.
Should we go to the next slide?
Yep.
Whoa.
Yeah, so the process of creating a public infrastructure district, and this is really important, especially for those that are here from a government or jurisdictional perspective. The statute was written so that a city or a county has to ultimately approve the use of a PID within the boundaries of a city or a county. And so typically the first step to creating a PID is that the governing body, whether that's a city or county, will create a policy. And they'll just outline, here's the types of infrastructure that maybe we want to allow to be financed with a PID, or here's the necessary things you need to submit to me before I'll consider it. And so the policy kind of establishes how you submit and how the information is going to be reviewed. After that, typically what happens, I know the slide says developer, but it's really landowner or property owner that has to submit for a PID. So in order for a PID to be formed, you need 100% landowner consent. So in other words, the landowner will petition or ask the jurisdiction to create a PID. And there has to be uniform 100% landowner consent in order to petition the city or the county to create a PID. So that's an important thing. This is done with 100% consent by all property owners that will be within the boundaries of the district. So you submit that letter of intent that outlines to the city or the county, what the request or what the ask is, and then you'll proceed to what's called the governing document. And so the governing document is really the charter of the PID. It puts the box around what the PID can do. So it'll define things like what's the maximum amount of bonds that can be sold, How are the bonds going to be repaid? What's the mechanism of repayment? What type of infrastructure is going to be paid for? It may just be certain pieces of infrastructure. Is it a water tank? Is it a road? Is it a combination of multiple things? Is it a park? At the end of the day, every piece of infrastructure that's paid for has to be public. So in other words, the ownership ends up in public hands, meaning a city, some other local district, a county, some public entity will own the asset. And so, again, this is just a financing vehicle where at the end of the day, the asset ends up in the hands of some public body. And so, in order to sell tax-exempt bonds to fund that infrastructure, legally it has to only be used on public infrastructure. So there's no private improvements that are funded with a PID, which is an important aspect. And then the last step is for the whatever jurisdiction you're in, whether that's a city or a county, to approve the governing document. Once the governing document is approved, it then, as Mike says, stands alone as a separate governmental entity that has its own board, its own accountants, lawyers, et cetera, and again, its only purpose is to finance. Once you finance and repay the financing, the PID actually goes away. There's no ongoing, purpose for it to exist other than to finance the upfront capital cost of infrastructure. So,
Yeah. This next slide here is just a real general slide of potential revenues that you could flow either through a PID or create by a PID, by the power of a PID, and then the potential use of proceeds, like Brennen said. For the most part, this is tax-exempt debt, but we're also using public revenues to pay for public infrastructure. So I think that kind of distinction is important. A PID has the ability to levy assessments and property tax mill levy up to whatever their governing document states, whatever the city or county allows that PID to levy that additional property tax mill levy. The PID can levy to repay debt that is issued up front. It is a way to flow potentially impact fees through the PID to support a debt issuance, municipal energy fees, sales tax increment, property tax increment, transient room tax. I think there's a lot of ways in which you can use a PID to issue debt. And I think one of the important things is the PID does not need to levy an additional tax. The PID could be created only to be a conduit issuer for that property to flow the tax increment from that property and up into bonds and to issue bonds. So the PID does not need to levy an additional tax. It is a power the PID has if the city gives it to it, but it is not necessarily a demand. So yeah, do you have any additions there? You want to jump to a case study?
yeah, no, I think this is all great in theory. So let's talk about some real examples and see where the tool's been used across the state. We only put a couple case studies in here, but there's a lot more that we can talk about if it's of interest during the Q&A section. But let's just give an example. So I saw Jody Hoffman earlier. I'm not sure if she's in here, but so the city of South Salt Lake had a little bit of an issue where they had created a zone, and that zone is more or less sort of defined in that picture there, where they called it sort of the downtown east streetcar area of their city. So they rezoned it and wanted to redevelop it, right? And so that redevelopment effort started to take root, and this was, I don't know, a decade ago or 8 years ago, whatever it was. And so they started redeveloping what I would more or less term as industrial or sort of warehouse type uses into things that are more mixed use. So there was apartment with retail on the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. And so pretty soon they ran out of sewer capacity, right? Because as you convert sort of industrial and those types of uses into higher density housing, they ran out of sewer capacity. And so there were a number of developers and landowners who wanted to continue to redevelop the area, and obviously the city wanted to redevelop the area. They amended their master plan to allow for the redevelopment of the area. But the problem is there was about a $20+ million lift to expand the sewer capacity. City didn't have the dollars to do it. Collectively, I think the developers maybe could have figured out a way to come up with the dollars, but no single developer is going to go put in capacity to serve that entire area. And so it was a huge lift from the landowner side as well. And so sort of the suggestion or the tool that was used to sort of balance all those interests was a PID, where we could sell the bond up front to raise the capital to increase the sewer capacity, not burden the city from a finance perspective, but also not require something unreasonable from a property owner perspective in terms of a huge lift up front. And so the PID was put in place, the bond was sold, the sewer is being expanded now. All those developers and landowners agreed to an incremental tax rate that will be on their properties that will pay for this sewer enhancement. But I think that was a trade-off everyone was okay with, again, because the alternative was someone would have to come with the cash to pay for it. And so this was an opportunity for both to solve a problem for both a city and landowners. Come together, use the PID as the tool, and then the repayment will occur over a long period of time.
Yeah, and I think jumping into another case study here, this is more of a case study of districts that were formed here recently, and kind of the process to form those districts. So this is the Jordan L. Ridge development in Heber. You'll see there on that starred map. Our group underwrote the debt. I saw Roger Henriksen back there somewhere for the Mayflower ski resort project and the Sky Ridge project. Both of those had components of public infrastructure districts in them. This is obviously just south of that. Just flipping to the next slide here, you'll see that the aerial, it's kind of hard to see on this map, but the red boundary is the totality of Jordan L. Ridge. The blue boundary is their first village. Jordan L. Ridge in total is over 6,000 units and over 200,000 square feet of commercial. They have a very large infrastructure hurdles ahead of them with the terrain that they're developing, along with some of what the city wanted, which we'll get into here in a couple slides. And so they created with Heber 5 public infrastructure districts that will cover the entirety of the red area. Those public infrastructure districts had 100% consent of the landowners within them, and the boundaries of those districts will depend on the boundaries of development as they continue along through their own development path. They're active out there right now, and they plan to issue debt next year. Kind of flipping to the next slide here, you'll see that some of the, this PID is going to pay for improved amenities that the city wanted for a lower cost of capital. In the case of Jordan L. Ridge, it's also going to allow for the PID to build a large regional park that the city wanted built fairly quickly and that they're going to put in their first village. I think when it comes to phasing of development and issuing debt and the timing of revenues versus the issuance of the debt, creating multiple districts so that we can be strategic about when and how we issue debt for each phase of the project is how we chose to go about this district formation. I think, the last couple bullets there, like I said, they have the option of issuing multiple bonds for the development. They have an approved bonding capacity of up to $250 million across all 5 districts to be repaid by an additional property tax levy that the users of the infrastructure will pay for the infrastructure that they're utilizing every day over a 30-year time horizon.
Yeah, I think that highlights sort of 2 different use cases of this tool, right? You have sort of a more dense area that's being redeveloped and can bridge gap of sort of old infrastructure and getting it to sort of updated and current infrastructure and getting the capacity needed for redevelopment activities, and then also kind of like a greenfield site where obviously you look at that picture and it's just a mountain, right? And like the cost of infrastructure to service an area like that is obviously very significant. And so again, just a tool to allow some of that financing to be pulled forward so that dollars can be put in the ground wisely. And the way that I think we all approach it is the city recognized that that was something that would be beneficial to the landowner, but also got some benefit and sought some benefit out that of saying, hey, look, instead of building out 5, 6, 7 years and then you give me your regional park, let's put the regional park up front so that everyone can enjoy it. And so 2 different use cases, but applicable in both cases. So.
Hey, thank you. Let's start with the audience. So how many in the audience that are from municipalities have a PID policy in place or have contemplated a PID? Okay, great. And as far as the dynamics behind a PID and how it functions and how it's set up, do you have any questions about those specifics? Yep, right in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I assume that the PID does do they construct the infrastructure?
Yeah.
They can.
Contract for and construct?
It can be either way. So it can be constructed and then deeded over, or the PID can actually go out and solicit the bids and build it.
But it's going to end up being owned by the municipality or the county.
Correct.
And then how does that fit with a perform or completion bond? Is that something completely separate? And do they still have that assurance?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll answer it honestly, which should always answer it honestly. But like that's been a little bit of a challenge, I'll be honest. So, for example, we go finance a PID bond, and the money is sitting in a third-party financial institution, and there's a trustee that manages those dollars, and the only legal use of that dollar is on public infrastructure. So then the city also requires a completion or a P&P bond, which is a little bit of a rub, right? We have money sitting here that can only legally be used on infrastructure, but then they're also asking for their typical, sort of completion bond. And so that's a little bit of a challenge because it's sort of doubling up. But so far, I think most have doubled up. I'd like over time, as this tool gets used, to recognize that the only legal use of the money sitting with a third-party financial institution is public infrastructure, and we can sort of cross that bridge and not necessarily need to double up. But so far, it's been kind of a doubling up, and it hasn't impacted that completion bond or sort of requirement from local jurisdictions.
And to that question, I think for the local governments in the room, probably part of that discussion will have to be circling back to your PID policy, because as you all know, some of those bond requirements are tied in with a lot of different things. So we probably as jurisdictions need to consider breaking out the PID paid for infrastructure and the other infrastructure that is probably being handled in those bonds as well. That's likely the reason that those are still being overlaid, but I think Brennen's right. From a security perspective, it's probably a lot more secure than even the bonds that we collect to have that sitting there in the bond and being distributed by the trustee. So certainly into the future, probably what we would need to do is go back and look at our PID policies and break out or make provision for a breakout of the things that are covered by the bond versus things we still have concern about. Right, Rob?
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. I'd love your perspective on. The comment is one way to deal with that issue is in the phase project. We tie the issuance of building permits to the successful completion of the improvements, and that's one way that you can enforce, not only the quality but the quantity. And then the other, question I have: could you comment a little bit on the PIDs that you have done, the percentage of what would be considered traditional improvements versus excessive improvements, or improvements above and beyond what the entity would normally require? And the reason I'm asking that is I found that it's a lot easier to negotiate with developers. From the city perspective, if the improvements are improvements that are true enhancements to that type of development, they're very tangible and visible to the residents, as opposed to putting in a lot of infrastructure that nobody ever sees. And yet, from the development community, and I get it, they want to heavily front end those costs to put in streets and roads and sidewalks and sewers. What are you seeing in the distribution of how those revenues are allowed in different policies or projects?
So there's 45 PIDs in Utah, that have been formed. Of those, I would say the vast majority of them have some, I'd say all of them have an element of enhanced infrastructure or whatever term you want to use. Are there some that are exclusive to only enhanced infrastructure? I'd say that'd be only a handful maybe. It's a combination of both is what we're seeing. And I think that goes to my earlier comment. Like when you're sitting at a table, there's multiple parties involved here. You have a jurisdiction, you have potential future residents who don't have a seat at the table at the moment, and then you have a property owner. And so every single one of those parties needs to be thought about when you're putting a PID in place. And so I think that the fact that all of them include aspects of both is a reflection of the good job that everyone is doing, and I hope it continues to remain that way, that all those parties are accounted for when these districts are set up.
I think too, like specifying it to specific improvements, like getting to that level of detail at that table is super important, whether it's a regional park or a school site or wider roads, wider sidewalks. You're typically negotiating your public infrastructure district governing document at the same time the developer is negotiating their development agreement, right? So tying those two kind of agreements together to marry with each other can be a helpful way to get what the city needs from the developer and for what the developer needs out of the project.
Go ahead.
What do you think is the minimum level of investment required in order to make a PID functional? In other words, given the transaction costs and the time involved, at what level does the PID make sense?
We've done transactions for 58 lots, and we've done transactions for 6,000 lots, and on a very, it's an economies of scale question. It's how many dollars are coming into the PID, how much are the annual expenses of the PID, how much does it cost to pay for your audit every year and pay for your attorneys every year. I'm not sure if there's like a number in my head necessarily, but when you run the math and it costs $80,000 a year inflating at 1% just to keep the PID concurrent with the standards in the governing document and ensuring that they're getting their reports to the city and getting their audits done, and you're generating $100,000 from your property tax mill levy, $20,000 a year, present value back to today at picker rate in this market, but it's not going to generate a ton. So
yeah, I mean,
it depends on the value.
Typically what we say is unless you have $1 million or $2 million of infrastructure costs, it's probably not going to make sense.
Yeah.
But almost everything these days seems to have that. So yeah, but by the time you pay for the offering process and then the ongoing audits and other things, because it is a separate governmental entity, you have to have some level of benefit or infrastructure that gets paid for it to make sense. So once you start getting under $1 million or $2 million, it starts to really turn the equation on whether this makes sense to do.
Thank you.
Gary?
Just to Rob's point, I envision a PID coming in for those extraordinary costs that are generally paid for by the impact fees. In other words, you got a road that needs to be built, constructed as part of the system improvements for the city, and the PID makes sense there, or when you're putting in a large water tank or a large sewer plant or something of that nature. But are you finding that developers are also using them for project improvements? In other words, for the streets in the subdivision, for things that generally the developer pays for up front and then is included in the cost of the property. I think that was one of the big concerns up front, was that, typically the developer pays for that and then it's included in the cost of the home and isn't an ongoing cost that the homeowner will experience through the life of, until it's paid off.
Yeah, good question. and I think you're narrowing in on the discussion we have with city councils around this state and staff around this state. That is the most common concern, and I think that's why, as we've seen these PIDs be formed that have been formed, it's been a good job, right? Like, the cities are pushing back because, to your exact point, there should be benefit on all sides. So I am not, like, a lot of the PIDs that we've been involved with have not been sort of like the internals, right? It's a bypass road, or it's a major road that is a major spine road, but all the laterals coming off that, those are not included in governing documents, right? And so again, I think it's just recognition that, all the parties at the table need to come up with a solution that makes sense. And your concern is probably concern number one that we've seen around the state, but the governing document can define that, right? And you can just specify what pieces of infrastructure get built with this type of financing.
This is somewhat addressing, Gary, what you just said, and from hopefully clarifying my understanding of what I've heard, and I'm on the developer side. I believe that when the increased mill levy is applied, our homes need to be sold, they're going to be sold at a lower rate to the homeowner so that their sales price will be lower. And that's their incentive. And yes, then it's captured on a higher tax rate over time until it's then paid off. Is that?
It's a good way to think about it. I mean, I think if the house is going to be sold for $400,000 without a PID, or for $450,000 or $375,000 with a PID, right? If you could finance $25,000 per lot in infrastructure, and pass that through in savings to the first home buyer, right? And then that home buyer who lives in it for 7 years, they pay their share of the infrastructure that was financed up front, and the family they sell it to pays for their share of the infrastructure for the next 7 years, and everyone shares in the infrastructure burden over 30 years, instead of the first home buyer experiencing that burden all on themselves.
Yeah, one other way to think about it too is, I mean, what you're driving at is in what I would term as disclosure, right? So we've done a lot of work with the Board of Realtors and others, so that in Rep Cs there is a section that calls out PIDs, so that anyone who's buying a home recognizes that there may be an additional tax rate or mill rate or whatever associated with this development. And so there's 4 places during the buying process where this would be disclosed to a homeowner, a future homeowner, if it's a residential project. And so disclosure becomes key, and that's also part of the governing document, and something that we champion and push as well, is that disclosure needs to occur throughout the process, so that if there is an incremental tax rate, which again, there's many PIDs that don't have an incremental tax rate. So I want to make that point. This is not just an incremental tax rate. There are other ways to finance. But if it is an incremental tax rate, that it's fully disclosed, and that, to this gentleman's point, it may adjust. When you look at that, right, it's going to be, when you go to get your mortgage, right, and they take out the escrow and for the taxes, it's going to be inclusive of the PID, and so they're going to qualify for slightly less, which would have an impact on the home pricing.
Is this market rate adjustment and these disclosures required by the law, or is this just something that's involved?
Two things. So it is required by the law, but maybe not 4 or 5 times. And that's why I'm saying, as someone involved in all of these, we are pushing additional disclosure to make sure that this is fully disclosed. So for example, what we've written into governing documents is there is a separate brightly colored sheet of paper that clearly states, here's the additional tax rate for being within a PID, and here's what it means for you in a dollars and cents basis. So that is separately disclosed, again, trying to be brightly colored sheet of paper to make sure. And so it's been an evolution of both. I think good participation from landowners and those involved in it to make sure there is good disclosure, and then 2, statutorily. So I think the disclosure is good, and I want to make sure we have keep that up, right?
So Mike and Brennen, can I ask one question? I bet it's the one you're gonna ask. That the disclosures of the increase in the tax rate, separate question from, have you seen cities, or is there a requirement whereby if they're going to offer to utilize this tool on behalf of a developer, that there is a corresponding decrease in sales price?
Well, I want to know if that's in the law.
It's
Or if
Right.
that's just
No.
a-
No, that's not in the law.
Rob?
In fact, I have had a dozen discussions with developers on a dozen different pits. And there's only one so far that we're moving ahead on, and it's actually $50 million worth of infrastructure. Not a single one of those developers has been willing, either through policy, the government documents, or through a development agreement or anything else, committed to actually decrease the sales price of that house. And I don't know that there's a legal way to force it.
I agree. I'm not sure that we as municipalities, although we may think that's a good plan.
I'd like to.
I'm not sure that there is a legal way to do that. That's why we were kind of going a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Go ahead and then you second.
From a developer's point of view, the pits that I've been involved in, there are two things. One is this shows up on title. And it's really no different from the developer's point of view than a special service district or other government taxing body who they're given notice of. If they're concerned about the tax burden, they'll see that in the title. Secondly, we do disclose that it's in the pit up front. So if that affects purchase price, it affects purchase price, but we're not going to offer it.
Private arm's length transaction
Right.
between buyer and seller, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and you haven't seen any other PIDs that have been set up any other way,
No.
right? Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Is there any reason a town couldn't put in their own PID on town-owned lands?
Yeah, so again, it's 100% landowner consent. So 100% landowners have to consent to the PID, so you have to petition the jurisdiction. So if you got 100% landowner consent, I mean, I haven't seen that yet, but I think theoretically there's probably a way. So let's chat. We'll figure it out. We'll
Okay, let's
figure
see.
it
I
out.
thought I saw a hand over here. Yes, go ahead.
Question, so to what extent, if at all, or if it's possible, could a PID account for the life cycle of this infrastructure? So, yeah, it'll get it built, but can it maintain it?
So a PID cannot maintain infrastructure. I think that's an important distinction between even some other states that have similar infrastructure districts across the Midwest. Statutorily, they cannot. And so that's why those infrastructure improvements are deeded over to the city or the county for improvement and are built for the city and the county specs. So they will be the ones who maintain and improve the infrastructure built by the PID.
It's a great question, because
Yeah.
of course you do have to scale that, right? Was there one over there? Go ahead.
I think you answered my question, which is, what's the benefit of a PID over a special improvement district? And I think you answered, or what's the difference between the two? I think you answered it, is the difference is this is purely a financing to create the infrastructure, whereas a special improvement district is to operate and maintain it.
That's correct.
Yeah, you could actually form both, right? Where the PID could be the upfront capital cost, and then a special improvement district could work with the ongoing
The operator.
operations and maintenance
And
of the assets.
I think there's another important distinction there. The PID could operate and maintain infrastructure that it owns so long as it is not using its revenue to do so. So if an HOA exists and the HOA has an agreement with the PID to give the PID their revenues to maintain a park, the PID could maintain that park. But the PID could not use their additional mill levy or assessments or fees that are imposed by the PID to maintain the park.
But the HOA can't own the park.
The HOA
No.
can't own the park, but the PID could own the park and pay for the park with their bond proceeds. Yeah.
Another question here, go ahead.
It was maybe more of a clarification comment. Through poor communication, I may have raised
No,
concern.
no, it was good, it was great.
But
Great
essentially,
question.
like the gentleman behind me said, the market will dictate the lower price, not necessarily us.
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody that's buying within a PID that we create, and I'm just gonna use some random numbers here, they're paying, $2,500 a year in property tax. but for the same payment across or the same house price across the street, you're only paying $2,000 a month. For me to be competitive and to continue to sell homes, I have to lower my price so that our payments, I can be that competitive. So
Correct.
just to make that clear.
Yeah.
What's the market? Yeah.
That's a good point.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Question about the bond. Is it the same as just a normal municipal bond? It's the same credit rating? The city is backing this or no?
Yeah, it's much more project finance based, I would say, than like full faith and credit of the city. This is just the PID's boundaries issuing the debt. The bondholder, whether it's Invesco, Nuveen, Goldman Sachs, Capital Group, these are large institutional buyers mandated in our statute that only, you have to be able to buy in certain denominations. You have to be an accredited investor. So you have to be a sophisticated investor to buy this debt, but it's just the debt of the district. And so therefore, if it's a development that's 500 houses and those 500 houses are closed with D.R. Horton and they've started on the infrastructure, the investor of that bond is believing that the infrastructure is going to get built, and then that the tax generator, D.R. Horton, is going to build the houses that are going to generate the mill levy revenue to pay for their bond back. So that's just one example. But in large part, the answer is no. You're not using the city's credit rating. This is not debt of the city or the county. This is just the debt of the PID.
One other way to think about it is because it is a standalone entity that's doing the financing, there is no recourse back to the city. So
Correct.
And that standalone entity is small enough that we're not going to go through the process of getting a credit rating, et cetera, et cetera. And so instead of this, like traditionally, if there was an SSA area, special assessment area, that's formed, and the city more or less that's reported in their financial statements. It's in their CAFR, etc. So there is like this tie to the city. With a PID, it's separate, and so it allows the city to sort of push the risk as instead of being in the real estate development world, that risk basically goes to bond investors who buy this type of security.
You guys said you underwrite.
Yeah.
And then whatever that rate is basically per project.
Correct.
Yeah. Eventually, the project will be built out. The bonds will be callable. The bonds will be called. The district will refinance its debt and may go get a credit rating from Moody's or S&P. That's not uncommon. And so at that point, the district could lower their interest rate, lower their mill levy potentially, lower their total debt cost, and keep the same final maturity, extend their final maturity, have all of the optionality available to them.
You got to wait till it's built out to do that, though.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So on that point, could you guys ballpark for us if this stays desirable and sustainable in the current market? Does it get more desirable and sustainable in the current and maybe future market? A little bit forecasting here. What do you guys think? From a tool perspective and from I look at it as a slot in the equity stack almost, in a way.
Yeah, so capital markets are a little bit in turmoil at the moment, as many probably in this room see in the news, et cetera, et cetera. So transacting these types of bonds is, the interest rate fluctuates, right, as the capital markets change. And so like everything else, the rates have gone up to issue this type of bond, but there's certainly still appetite. So prior to working as a banker and putting the transactions together and underwriting and selling, I worked on the buy side. So I was buying all of these. And so I'd go around the country and look at all these different projects that were putting in this infrastructure, and we would determine whether we wanted to buy this or not. So I look at the capital flows that are flowing across our country, and I think, why is Utah not getting a piece of that capital flow? There are billions of dollars being deployed every year in infrastructure projects across the country through the use of special districts. And so it's only until recently where Utah has a tool now where we can grab our piece of that capital that's flowing around the country to help finance infrastructure. And so if you look at it from a bigger picture, I think this is a good opportunity for our state to access bigger pools of capital. I mean, we're talking the largest institutions in the world, and grab a piece of that to help finance infrastructure across our state in a situation where it's relatively new. We've only done this for 2 or 3 years, and so I see this as an opportunity it will continue to grow, and that the flows of capital across this country will spend more time in Utah, and they are spending more time in Utah because the tool exists.
How many of you were surprised by 45 PIDs being created? Surprising number, right? Go ahead, Terry, and then you. Yeah.
So there's 2 things that are happening right now legislatively. One is that there's an effort to try and take the government out of the process at all on PIDs, and then there's another process called DID, which I don't know if you've heard of yet, but where they're looking at it's actually a special improvement district, essentially is what it was, establishing a special improvement district without the government approval. In other words, they could just do it on their own as a special district is what they could do. So first of all, what would be the difference between the two if the government doesn't have anything?
So there's two proposals on the table, and they are very early stage. So the DID, for lack of a better term at this point, is very, very high level at this point. And it would not require local jurisdictional approval, but it would require pay down before transfer to a third party. So in other words, before a homeowner, a commercial user, or someone else takes ownership of or title of something, whatever financing was used would have to be paid down at that time. Now, whether that's something sustainable that Mike and I can sell in the capital markets is TBD, which is why I've asked to be involved in those conversations, and we're in them now because we need to create something that's going to be usable in the capital markets. And again, as I've said, we want to do things that make sense for. There's 3 parties. We want to make sure that it makes sense for all 3 parties. And so the current proposal, again, super high level. It would require that it be repaid, and that there's no ongoing obligation to any third party buyer.
But it is for public infrastructure?
Only for public infrastructure as well.
And so then who are they turning that over to when it's paid off?
So it would be for the traditional things we're talking about, roads, sewer, water, etc. And so, again, they're not going to build something unless they know someone's going to take it over, right? So it's just, that's kind of like asking, well, why does any city take anything from a developer, right? You don't know how they finance it now, but why do you take it, right? But again, we're just focusing on a financing tool. It doesn't impact how or when or what infrastructure a city will take. They will still retain all the powers that they have to determine whether they want to take that infrastructure or not. And I guarantee you it's not going to be built unless someone's already agreed to take it, right?
Gotcha.
So.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I just learned if you've ever had a developer walk, and if you have, what's the fallout? Who picks up the pieces?
Yeah, that's happened several times after debt's been issued. I think the market in Colorado, I guess just a state over, has a similar tool. Debt was issued, in the early 2000s, in 07 and 08. We went through the financial crisis. There were developers who lost their real estate, who lost their land. Those bondholders were eventually called because somebody bought that land. Somebody eventually developed it. And because there is a property tax, there is a mill cap. And so if you bought one of the first 100 houses in a development and the other 400 were supposed to come, and the developer did not develop those 400 and that got delayed 4 years, and you had an additional 3 mills on your property for your bonds to pay, you still only paid your 3 mills. You didn't have to pay the other 400 lots that didn't get developed. You didn't have to pay their share of the infrastructure. You just had to pay your share of the 3 mills. So the bondholder went unpaid in that circumstance. Like Brennen said, the bondholder took the risk. So to this gentleman's question, it's much more of a underwriting the developer, underwriting the home builders, how much equity does the developer have into the project. That's what these bondholders are doing prior to buying the bonds. because they want the vertical to show up so that they get repaid. They understand if it doesn't, that the owners within that district just pay whatever their max is and
Yeah,
bonds go unpaid.
from a city perspective, and just to be clear, that has not happened in Utah. Now, we haven't been through a cycle yet, so I'm not saying that
Yeah,
will never happen.
tools
But
new.
just to be clear, it has not happened in Utah yet. So and then the second thing that's important to say from a city or a jurisdictional perspective, one of the most important things is that the infrastructure gets delivered, right? So if a developer walks, remember the PID is its own entity. The funds will be in a third-party account. Its only legal use is to finance the infrastructure. So in terms of putting the infrastructure in, it's actually a more sure way, because if a developer walks halfway, you get half-built roads and et cetera, et cetera. This is a way to know that all the infrastructure is going to get built. Now, whether it takes longer for the homes to show up, that's a different question, but at least the infrastructure will be built.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you seen, what difference have you seen in either the marketability of bonds or the repurchasing between a PID that finances infrastructure for commercial or manufacturing projects as opposed to a residential project? Does that have any ability on the market, any influence either on the rate or the marketability?
Yeah, I mean, they're two very different product types. And so they get underwritten differently, and the market thinks about them differently, depending on the area that they're in and the users that are involved in that project. I think for commercial projects that do financings up front, given that commercial users are likely sensitive to the NOI overall burden of their property tax rate, typically it's a lower property tax burden. I'd say most commercial projects borrow money later in the stage as well. Let vertical occur, let assessed valuation occur on the property prior to borrowing money. But I don't know, Brennen, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in short, it's more expensive for commercial.
Yeah.
And let me just give you a simple example. So the repayment source, if it's property taxes, let's say that there's a 50-acre commercial and a 50-acre residential. That 50-acre residential is going to turn into 100 taxpayers. So if any one of those 100 doesn't pay their property taxes, the bond's still going to work. On the 50 acres of commercial, let's say you have 3 commercial users. If one of those guys decides not to pay their taxes, it's a different underwrite for the bondholders. So the rate's higher on the commercial, just as a simple example. There's many factors, but that's hopefully illustrates a little bit of the difference.
Okay, we have 3 more minutes. Yep, go ahead.
At what point does the infrastructure get transferred to the municipality?
Yeah, good question. So there is no change to how that process works currently. So again, if you don't know how infrastructure gets financed right now and it gets transferred to you, a PID doesn't change anything. It's just a different way to pay for it. So the same process that exists now for accepting or transferring any infrastructure is the same way it will be with a PID. Does that answer your question?
I mean, yeah, we're talking about, this is gonna finance construction of infrastructure and potentially in the development over time.
Right.
And so portions of it are going to be constructed over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to
Yes.
see if there was anything
No,
that's different.
no differences. So city engineer will come out, inspect it. Is this to spec? Is this what we wanted? Is this what we all agreed to? Inspection process will play out as it normally does anytime you accept infrastructure.
Good question. Was there one other? Go ahead.
I've got two questions that are tied. It sounds like you're saying that this PID can be a replacement for a bond, essentially a cash bond. And if so, can the city, will the PID pay out to have infrastructure done if a developer walks, if there's nobody to go vertical? Like, do they really want to pay money out if there's nobody, security to go, up?
Well, at that point, the bond's already sold and fully funded. So there's no taking the money back at that point.
Like a withdrawal?
Yeah, there's no taking the money back at that point. Now, that's still a bridge to cross that I said we haven't crossed yet. Right now, every city is requiring a cash bond or their typical completion bond. So, but eventually, maybe it will get to the point where that won't be required. That has not happened yet.
So a city could access it in theory.
In theory, yes.
Go ahead.
Since this is a relatively new financing vehicle that legislatures allowed us to use, do you foresee the legislature making any changes in the near future that's going to update or change this anyway?
I mean, bills are passed to be amended, right? Like, I mean, they're always getting revised to some degree, I think. I think it could be adding the ability for the PID to levy an operations and maintenance tax potentially as a much lower component of the debt service mill levy that they can levy, so that they can own and operate improvements themselves, like rec centers or parks or snow removal, trash services, those types of things. Not, kind of energy or some of the bigger monopolies, but just their project specific improvements that they have. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there could be more legislative changes. So as we've done some of these financings and had the real world practical experience, there's a few things that are clunky in the legislation, to be honest. And so I view those as more just cleanups.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, whether there's major changes in the future, I mean, that's anyone's guess. But in terms of just like the existing statute, there's a few just little clunky things that I think should be cleaned up and will be cleaned up. But yeah, on the bigger stuff, I don't know yet.
Okay, very good. Well, it's time to wrap up. As you can tell, we have really two very sophisticated and expert-laden folks with us from Piper Sandler and DA Davidson. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them. And all of the PIDs that have been done in the state, they're a lot. 45 is a lot. So there's a lot of experience here, and sure appreciate the time.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah.